It is my honor to participate in this collaborative project. Our speakers today for the Identifying and Reporting Spotted Lanternfly and Tree of Heaven with New York iMapInvasives are Tom Allgaier and Michael Giambalvo from New York State Department of Ag and Markets, and from the New York Natural Heritage Program, Jennifer Dean, Mitch O'Neill, Meg Wilkinson, and the last person there, Meg Wilkinson, is me. The goal today is to train volunteers across the state to identify spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven and report both presence and not detected to iMap. This work will complement work being conducted by state agency staff. I will do a few welcome slides, then Tom will cover spotted lanternfly, Michael will cover Tree of Heaven, Jen and Mitch will cover iMap, and we'll loop back to me for wrap-up. First, I want to acknowledge the many people across the state, individuals, agencies, and organizations that work on invasive species. I want to draw to your attention that the efforts across the state, as well as the iMap platform, are all taxa. Today, we are going to focus on two species, Tree of Heaven and spotted lanternfly. And as we go through the presentation, you'll figure out why those two were picked. This is a coordinated statewide effort involving many people, and especially you. So I'm going to say this now. You're going to hear this several times during the course of the webinar. When you contribute data, which we thank you in advance for contributing, we do encourage you to submit the best photo possible, and people also mention you can take extra photos that are on your phone in case anyone needs additional photos to help make a confirmation. Those photos are incredibly important for confirming or not confirming the species. I will also highlight that for this project, the Tree of Heaven records will be reviewed by the iMap Confirmer Network, which is a network of experts across the state who help with confirming records, volunteers and professionals. The spotted lanternfly data itself will be reviewed by New York State agency staff. We did our first of 4 webinars for this in February, and we've had incredible participation to date. Over 244 grid squares have been claimed, and over 500 records have been submitted. Remember, those 500 records include spotted lanternfly data and Tree of Heaven data, as well as presence data and not detected data. And thankfully, most of the spotted lanternfly data has been not detected. Only a couple came in as presence. And we do thank people for those not detected records. They're very helpful. All right, so for this team effort, our goal today, our objectives, is to make sure everyone is comfortable identifying spotted lanternfly and Tree of Heaven, comfortable using iMapInvasives, and that they will set up and select a square and be ready to survey their square. We will also measure that with the poll. So the poll you just took at the beginning, we will do a similar poll at the end and then compare those results. And with that, I will, I think next slide, please. I will mention 3 more small notes. The first is, many of you are used to WebEx and Zoom, and you'll notice on this particular interface, there are 2 ways to submit a question. One is in the chat box, and one is in a Q&A box. If you have WebEx issues, please put those in the chat box, and John Marino will work with you to solve those. If you have questions for one of the presenters, please put those in the Q&A box. Second, I'll mention if you are a New York State certified pest applicator, this webinar has been approved for some continuing education credits. To obtain those credits, watch for a link in an email that Mitch sends post this webinar. You do need to take a quiz for those credits. And Last, I'll mention that, I think I already mentioned, this is a 4-part webinar series, so this is the second one, and we have the special evening event as part of Invasive Species Awareness Week at 7 o'clock with just Q&A and panels and experts. And then there'll be another webinar in August, and then there'll be one in fall we have not set the date for yet. And with that, I pass the mic to Tom.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Allgaier, the Invasive Species Coordinator with New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets within the Division of Plant Industry. So last time we met, we talked a little bit about egg masses, or a lot of it about egg masses and spotted lanternfly. So this will cover some of the same ground, but we're really going to concentrate on the early instar nymphs, which is the life stage that we're dealing with in New York right this minute. So next slide. So spotted lanternfly, a little history. Lycorma delata it's a native to Southeast Asia, China, Vietnam, that sort of region. It was discovered in Pennsylvania in 2014 and has slowly, steadily expanded since then. Last year, being found in New York for the first time, and so we've been preparing for it for years, and now we're actually dealing with it firsthand. So spotted lanternfly, very much like an aphid, uses its mouth part, its piercing, sucking mouth parts to feed on sap from plants. It doesn't so much suck the sap out. It uses the sap pressure in the plants, the turgid pressure, to actually push the sap through its body. So it doesn't necessarily suck the sap out. It just kind of filters through. It's kind of a generalist feeder. There's at least 70 host species. We concentrate on things like tree of heaven, some of the important agricultural crops like apples, grapes, and hops, along with maple and black walnut because of the threat. But as an early instar nymph, it'll feed on most anything that it can get its piercing, sucking mouth parts into. So very tender new growth. But there's at least 70 plants that it'll feed from. Next slide. One of the other impacts, the side effects, if you were, of spotted lanternfly, when they do that filter feeding, a lot of the sugars, they feed on a lot of sugar-rich plants like grapes and apples. So that sticky substance that comes out, that's their excrement, which is mixed with the tree sap, is called honeydew, very much like aphids. That honeydew, that sugar sweet excrement, is ripe, fertile ground for blooms of sooty mold, and that's a secondary issue. It's kind of a nuisance issue, but it's also a survey tool indicator. You can see in some of these pictures, the upper right hand side, the base of the tree, some of the rocks and the roots in the ground are just covered with sooty mold. This sooty mold also attracts stinging insects, especially in the fall, things like yellow jackets and things like that, and bees and wasps. You can see the upper left-hand side there, a car that was parked on, near spotted lanternfly, and you can see the sooty mold bloom on the top of the car there, and you can see the contrast in the silver doors versus the very gray, almost black roof. The bottom photo on the left, you can see sooty mold covering plant leaves. That's one of the things that causes some damage. The sooty mold is so thick that it inhibits or reduces the plant's ability to photosynthesize. And on the right, you can see why this would be a nuisance. The little left-hand corner there on the walkway is nice and clean and power washed, and somebody was nice enough to write sooty mold right across the sooty mold to give you a little bit of contrast. It's sticky, it's wet, it's goopy. Nobody wants to go outside in their yard and their patio and sit, on patio chairs and furniture covered in sooty mold. So it's a nuisance pest as well as an agricultural pest, as well as a general forest pest. So next slide. So us being with the Department of Agriculture, our primary concern, of course, would be with agricultural commodities. New York State is number 2 for apple production in the nation, and number 3 for grapes. So you can see those two products here, and you can see the masses of adult spotted lanternfly on that apple trunk, and then also on the vines or the grape leaves below there. It looks like Concord grapes. And on the right, you can see an adult, again, with sooty mold. You can see it's kind of shiny and silvery. That's the wet excrement where the honeydew, where the sooty mold has not quite started to grow yet. And then the blackened parts of the leaves, especially towards the bottom right, are areas where sooty mold has started to bloom and cover those leaves. You can see some of the leaves in the background there on the left that are starting to senesce, and that's largely in part due to the effects of sooty mold. So nationally, like I said, we're ranked pretty high for some of these agricultural crops. It just happens to be spotted lanternflies, some of their favorite foods. It also impacts forests and other, like I said earlier in the earlier slide, it's a nuisance pest as well, but it also has environmental impacts in the forest. Next slide. The most recent map that we have, thanks to the Northeast IPM Center, as you can see here, Berks County is about the center part of the blue area in Pennsylvania, and you can see how it has spread primarily east and west, and slightly south since its detection, and now it's just touching in New York. You can see the area near Ithaca there in the center, in the Finger Lakes area, and then Richmond, Orange, and Sloatsburg area. I can't think of the county there. So these are very small infestations in New York, with the exception of Staten Island. Staten Island is very heavily, everywhere we surveyed, we were finding spotted lanternfly. The other areas were very limited numbers, especially Ithaca and Port Jervis. They were very small locations. So, next slide. So the life cycle. As I mentioned in my introduction, the life stage that we're at now is the early instar nymphs. So the first 3 life stages, as it goes through its metamorphosis, it'll shed its exoskeleton 3 times, but remain basically the same. It'll be the same as the bottom center photo there, a black insect, very tiny at first, with white dots. Each consecutive time that it sheds its skin, and it'll metamorphosize into a slightly larger version of itself. The 4th time, however, it'll metamorphosize into the 4th instar nymph, which is on the right. You'll start to see red wing pads. The insect will be a little bit larger at that point. Much easier to spot in the environment. So the early instars are very difficult to spot in the environment, just because they blend in really well, and they're not very bright colored, and are also, when they first hatch, they're very, very tiny. Think very small, like a tick. The 4th time that they go into metamorphosis, they emerge with their wings intact. So the adults will be found, mid-July all the way through to the first heavy frost. That's typically the life stage. Most of the photos that you see, especially with its wing spread. However, this photo in the life stage, the center and the top, the lateral view there, that's more likely what you'll see is them crawling around with their wings folded versus flying. And you can see a little bit of that reddish pink under the translucent forewings. When that's opened up, that's where you get the that bright red, vibrant red wings. It's the hind wings, and when they're walking around, they're generally covered. They're slightly pinkish hue to them. And then the adults will start laying eggs. The eggs are the life stage we covered the last time, and they're in the environment, and they're detectable most of the year at some point, either as eggs that have just hatched, or eggs that are freshly laid, or eggs that'll hatch soon. Currently, right now, we're in the stage where the egg masses are hatching. So if you do find eggs at this time of the year, they've either already hatched or about to be hatched. And that brings us back to where we are now with the early instars hatching out. So next slide. Again, just another visual little infographic. So as I said, the eggs can be seen most of the year, September through June. Right now, we're in that beginning of that 4-month period, or middle of that 4-month period, where the the eggs start hatching, and you can find all three of those, black and white. It looks like the circle larva stage there, on a nymph stage, sorry, on the left side there, the black and white early nymphs. And you'll find those until about the middle of July, when it starts really heating up, and then they'll metamorphosize into the late instar. We'll cover that at another time. Next slide. Again, just a little bit of recap. I know we touched on this the last time, but some of you weren't with us. So the egg masses can be covered or uncovered. The adults lay approximately 30 or 40 eggs per egg mass. Most often they're covered. The covering starts off white and kind of glossy, and then fades in texture and color. Basically, it resembles mud. Here on this very young Ailanthus tree, you get that cantaloupe-like skin. I think Michael will talk a little bit more about that later. But the egg mass just blends right in, as do the adults. The uncovered eggs are a little bit easier to spot, but so that's really what we're looking for, is these hatching eggs at this point, and then the early instar nymphs. Next slide. So again, very easily camouflaged. You can sort of see that egg mass there in the middle, but if you click one more time, you can really zoom in on that area there. They're very difficult to see in the environment, especially if there's any cloud cover, or if it's a rainy day, or if it's late in the day. Unless it's a bright, shiny day, it's very difficult to detect these in the environment. So next slide. So the predictive models that we've been using are from the USDA, and they've supplied us with some great data. And as you can see here, currently our area of New York, I'm in the Albany area, so we're about between 1 and 50%, slightly more than 50% of nymph emergence. So we're kind of at peak emergence for those early instars, which is where we're at now. Not that spotted lanternfly is known to be in Florida, but if we were at that point, almost all the adults would be active at this point. Definitely a great tool, and it's updated frequently. We can always share that with you. So that's what the science is based on, where we when we predict and how we base our operations and how we direct our surveys and trapping methods, based on this predictive map. So next slide. Dr. Christian Weichert from our friends over there in Pennsylvania was able to capture this image here on the left, where they emerge like many insects. When they first hatch, their exoskeleton hasn't hardened off yet, and they appear to be white and translucent, almost see-through. So you can see these couple that are white on the left side, and then the ones to the right, you can start to see little spots, and they're starting to gray up a little bit. That's probably the first few minutes that they've emerged from their egg mass. On the right side there, our friends over at New York State Parks have captured that image down in Staten Island. And those nymphs are still kind of clustered around that egg mass. So you can see the egg mass in the center of the photo. In the center of those nymphs that have emerged. They're very, very tiny. If you're looking at your screen right now, probably the E in Orange County is about the size of the nymphs that you would see in the field. Very, very tiny, very difficult to detect. And when they're very young, they like to disperse. And how they do that most readily is they climb tall objects, trees, electrical towers, buildings, cars, anything that they can climb up, telephone poles. Actually, they're using telephone poles in New Jersey as a trapping method. They're trying to incorporate this habit that they have there into the trapping. So there's some test traps going up this year in New Jersey to see how that goes. Or sorry, Pennsylvania. So they climb up these tall objects, and then they kind of launch themselves into the wind, and then they get carried and dispersed that way. So they don't have wings when they're this young. They do when they're adults, but at this stage they're so tiny they can be carried by the wind. So they kind of migrate to the top of these tall structures, launch themselves on a windy day, and they get dispersed wide and far. So once they hatch, once they get away from this stage here on the, as the photo on the right shows, they're very difficult. They can hide in these little nooks and crannies. They're up in the tree canopy, up way higher than we can see, and then they disperse themselves. So it's very difficult to detect this life stage in the field. Next slide. Again, Brian Eschenauer was in Pennsylvania at a vineyard, and he had captured this image of nymphs emerging from an egg mass on a post, and you could start to see that they're slightly lighter colored. Their chitin, their exoskeleton is starting to harden up and colorize. And then on the right side, you can really see those white spots against that light colored wood background. And that's an egg mass that's not fully hatched out yet. You can see they're starting to emerge. So it looks just like a strip of mud in both cases, although you can see there's some color variation from tan to gray. Where the egg mass was laid, how much weathering it was subjected to over the winter. There's a lot of variation in color and texture. The texture on the one on the right, you could see that it was smoothed over, and then where they hatched, it's kind of broken up a little bit. So if you do see these egg masses at this time of year, you might be able to tell whether they're old egg masses that have hatched or if it's a newly egg mass, a viable egg mass that has not hatched out yet. You can also, it's hard to see in this photo on the right, but the actual eggs have a little slit in them. The back part kind of opens up when the nymphs emerge. So it looks like little grains of rice, and there's a slit, and it opens up almost like a little pocket. So next slide. When they first emerge, as I mentioned earlier, they like to feed on tender new growth. They have very, very tiny mouth parts, so they need to feed on very thin-skinned plants. One of their favorites is black walnut. Another one of their favorites is the fresh new growth from Tree of Heaven. So Alanthus altissima. So the very fine tips of the plants, especially this time of year when there's a lot of new growth and it hasn't hardened off and it hasn't really gotten woody yet, it's still very tender. You can see these early instar nymphs. I'm going to guess those are probably second instar nymphs on that walnut there on the left side, and actually Tree of Heaven, sorry. Tree of Heaven on the left side. I thought that was walnut, but I'm starting to see notches on those leaves. And then walnut on the right, as they get a little bit older, they have those the red wing pads. But again, they kind of migrate towards those two plants, especially that tender new growth. So, next slide. So the take-home messages that we currently have are, that the early instar nymphs are what we're looking for now, and they're very difficult to detect in the environment. Partially because they're generalist feeders and they disperse really well. But again, focus in on that tender new growth of Tree of Heaven. Michael will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And also black walnut. If you have young black walnuts, they really attracted to that. And the think ticks, they're often confused as ticks. We've had reports of people having Christmas trees infested with ticks when it was actually nymphs. That was reported in New Jersey. So if you think it's a tick, take a second look. It might be spotted lanternfly. But they're about the same size. And as Meg mentioned earlier in the introduction, negative survey is good. So we know that people have been out there looking and not found it, so that we can direct our efforts someplace else where we haven't surveyed, or concentrate our area in areas where we know we have found it, and stopping it from spreading. So just because you look for it and don't find it, don't think that's wasted time. It's really, really, really valuable information. Negative survey is good. I can't stress that enough. All survey is good, but negative survey is even better because we know it's not there and we can move on to other areas. And then there's our adult staring at us, looking us down, waiting for a fight, and we're ready to give it a fight. So,
thanks so much, Tom. That was great. And so the next part of today is Michael Giambalvo from Ag and Markets will talk about Tree of Heaven.
So I'll be letting everyone know how they can identify tree of heaven in the spring and summertime, so they can report it to iMapInvasives, as well as look for spotted lanternfly nymphs and secondary, third, and even fourth instars on this species that is, like Tom said, very much preferred by the spotted lanternfly. Next slide. So tree of heaven has a very similar native range to spotted lanternfly. Central China, Taiwan. It really likes disturbed soils where there's been a lot of human disturbance. So I took that top picture in just like an industrial area next to a building. You'll often see it there growing out of just cracks in the concrete or next to the foundation of a building. It does need a lot of light to grow, so you're not going to see it really in the interior of a forest, but more of an edge species. It doesn't need much water to grow, and in those places that it does like to grow, like next to a foundation, it could actually damage a foundation of building, so you want to try and remove it if you can, if you're concerned about something like that. It can crowd out native species with its dense canopy, and it also will release some chemicals from its roots that change the soils to make it more hospitable for more tree of heaven to grow. So these are just some interesting facts that might help you remember tree of heaven a little better. It was brought over in the 1700s by a gardener, and it was planted in Pennsylvania. It's thought in some arboretums initially. It was also, they attempted to grow silk moths on tree of heaven, but I don't think that worked out very well. It was the subject of that novel, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and because it was so prolific there, that's why it was the subject of that book. And you could see on the cover, it's growing out one of its favorite places next to a foundation of a building. That map is a recent screenshot of the positive tree of heaven data on IMAP. And you could see that we have a lot of the state covered with tree of heaven data reports from the public. But we want to fill in those gaps and also want to get some negative reports in. So that's why I'm giving this presentation today, so we could get more reports in. Tree of heaven's a large tree, it can get very tall, up to 80 feet. It will spread rhizomously or through its roots, as well as its seeds, which makes it more invasive. And in that top picture, the tall trees are tree of heaven, and then there's also a lot of smaller trees in front of it that are also tree of heaven that are spreading from the larger tree's roots. And then that bottom picture is just a small sapling you could see, and that'll quickly grow into a tall tree within just a few years. That's part of the reason they call it tree of heaven, because it grows so fast upward. Tree of heaven has an alternate leaf arrangement, which you can definitely see now that we're in late spring, early summer. It's really leafing out now. And alternate leaf arrangement you can see on the left side of that upper right hand drawing of different leaf arrangements. It's so the leaves won't be just right opposite each other on a branch. They'll kind of be staggered up and down it. Tree of heaven's leaves are pinnately compound, which you can see examples of different compound leaves, or not compound leaves. A simple leaf isn't a compound leaf in that upper right hand drawing. So that's something to look for when trying to identify tree of heaven is the pinnately compound leaf. The leaflet shape for tree of heaven is very distinct. It's got a smooth margin, meaning the edges of the leaves don't have teeth. They're smooth, straight, but they do have little rounded teeth at the base of each leaf. There could be anywhere from 1 to 4 on the base of a leaf. And you can see that in the red circle that I have on those photos. And that's a really important identifying factor this time of year for Tree of Heaven. There's also a gland at those teeth or lobes on the leaflets, which emits an odor. I think some people say it can smell like corn chips. I don't know. It doesn't smell that great, in my opinion. So that's something to look for. If you crush the leaf, you could really smell it. Now that the weather is getting warmer, Tree of Heaven will start flowering. The flowers aren't that noticeable in the environment. They're just kind of small and white, nothing too showy. And the Tree of Heaven is dioecious, meaning that there are male and female individuals. You won't find male and female flowers on the same tree. They'll be on separate trees. And they're not super easy to tell apart without getting really close up to the flower with a hand lens. So that's not something to worry about. But if you see these white flowers in conjunction with other identifying features, then you know you have Tree of Heaven. The seeds, which will appear later in the summer, are very showy, and they'll go from green to this pink yellow color, which really stands out when you're just driving along the highways and you see it. The seeds will eventually turn brown later in the fall and persist through the winter, where they'll eventually fall out and plant more Tree of Heaven. The pith is an identifying factor all year round. It's a soft, spongy texture and has a distinct smell of burnt peanut butter. So you can just cut or break open a twig if you're not sure if it's Tree of Heaven and look for this pith. The smell is more noticeable during the warmer weather rather than when it's colder out. So that's something to look for this time of year if you want to identify Tree of Heaven. The bark is an identifying feature all year round. Some people describe it as cantaloupe skin because it's got these white lines in it, kind of like some melons do. And that's always helped me remember it. It doesn't take long for the bark to acquire that lightly furrowed white striping, but the really new saplings and growth will have more of a texture like on the far right photo of that thin sapling, where it's kind of just a light brown color, maybe even a little tinge of green with small dots. Those are the lenticels on it. And you will see a lot of new growth this time of year with that type of bark as well. So we are still seeing some of this early growth on Tree of Heaven in late spring, and it has this kind of brown color to it when the leaves are first starting to unfurl. And that's definitely something to look for, especially if you keep chopping it down during spring yard work and it keeps trying to grow back. You'll see this brown color to the very, very new leaves. Now I have that the twig is the most identifying feature during winter, but it can actually be an identifying feature all year round. So this is something you would want to take a picture of if you're submitting a report to IMAP. The leaf scar on the twig is very distinct. It's kind of heart-shaped. Its bud is just above that heart shape, and then it has a bunch of dots going along the bottom of the heart, which are the vascular bundles for the leaf. On the right, I have some comparisons to its lookalike twigs, because there are other heart-shaped leaf scars on twigs, even of trees that have other features that look like tree of heaven, walnut especially. But you can see the terminal bud at the end of that twig is very different than tree of heaven's terminal bud. Sumac, which is another lookalike of tree of heaven and grows in a lot of the same spaces. Its leaf scar is slightly different because its bud is directly in the center of it, which I'll talk about more later. But you can see the difference between tree of heaven and sumac there. It's tree of heaven's twig and branches and just the whole tree gets a lot larger. And then there's horse chestnut, whose leaf scar on the twig is heart-shaped and looks similar, but again has a very different terminal bud on the end of the twig. It'll be a very large bulbous bud. So as I was saying, sumac is a lookalike of tree of heaven. It has pinnately compound leaves like tree of heaven, but the leaves are serrated and definitely don't get quite as large as tree of heaven. The tips of sumac's branches will have its fruit or flowers on it that look like red cones. There atop you could see what they look like without leaves on the tree, which is going to tell you that that's definitely sumac and not tree of heaven. It has those red tufts on the end of the branches. That bottom photo is just a closer look at sumac's twig, which is pretty distinct. That photo all the way on the right shows where tree of heaven and sumac can grow right in the same spaces, both like disturbed soils. So the taller trees are tree of heaven in the background, and then right in front is sumac. So you can see why you might get them mixed up sometimes. Next slide. Here's another look at sumac's leaf. Just trying to show that serrated edge of the leaflets on the leaf. You can see they have little teeth all around. Next slide. Here's another easy way to tell the difference between tree of heaven and sumac this time of year is when you break a leaf off, tree of heaven will have a clear sap that isn't really visible in these photos, and then sumac has a milky white sap when you break off a leaf, and that's a good way to tell the difference when you're trying to identify tree of heaven. Next slide. Another lookalike is walnut, which, like Tom was saying, is a preferred host of the early spotted lanternfly nymphs. You could see that heart-shaped bud scar on that second photo in, but it also has that kind of like a monkey face smile on the bottom of it, which tree of heaven won't have. You could also see the terminal bud, and if it has those green balls anywhere near it, that would probably be later in the summer. You'll know that that's definitely black walnut and not tree of heaven, because tree of heaven does not have a fruit like that. Here I put ash up because to the untrained eye, ash's pinnately compound leaves might look like tree of heaven, but ash's leaves will only get around 7 leaflets on green and white ash, when tree of heaven will get a lot more leaflets, a longer leaf, which is a good way to tell the difference between the two. So we'll continue to encourage everyone to check their trees, especially if they know they have tree of heaven around where they're at. Keep looking for the early instar nymphs and eggs, and report them to iMapInvasives when you find them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And so the next part of the agenda has to do with iMapInvasives. So I will pass it over to our invasive species biologist, Jennifer Dean.
All right, great. Well, thanks to Tom and Michael for a great overview of spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. And so now that you know what you're looking for, we're going to transition into learning about iMapInvasives and the statewide survey grid. So first I want to give you a quick introduction to the New York Natural Heritage Program, which is the organization that manages iMapInvasives for New York and the organization that Mitch, Meg, and I all work for. And so the program is a partnership between the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. And the Heritage Program helps facilitate the conservation of our state biodiversity by providing data and expertise on rare species, natural communities, and the threats to these. And since invasive species are a major threat to many of our state resources, our invasive species database program manages data and provides data products to our many state partners. Next. So we manage data on invasive species for the state through iMapInvasives. And this is an online mapping system that's New York's centralized database. The system is freely available to resource professionals and the interested public to report locations, explore the maps, sign up for email alerts, and many other advanced features. Next. And there's three main types of data within iMapInvasives. There's the presence, not detected, and treatment. We're going to focus on those first two for this effort. So both the presence and the not detected records can be entered through the mobile app that Mitch is going to talk about in a little bit. And those reports that you enter are going to go straight into the online maps. And so presence records can either be confirmed, meaning that the photo has been reviewed by an expert and the identification is deemed correct, or unconfirmed, which means the record still needs to be reviewed or a photo is missing. And there are some special species that are so high priority that those records are hidden from the public. And the spotted lanternfly falls into this category. So as reports come in, only certain state agency and PRISM staff can see the data. And this means that if you do report a suspected spotted lanternfly, you will not be able to see the report yourself, but please know that it's getting into the right hands. Which leads to a very important part of iMapInvasives, the email alerts. So as reports come in, depending on what species they are, well, as reports come in, they all come in as unconfirmed, and then depending on what species they are, they either go to the state authorities to get reviewed, so things like spotted lanternfly, or for more common species, we have a team of confirmers, and then once a report is determined confirmed, that data is available on the public map services, and email alerts for other IMAP users are triggered. However, just a reminder that that data for spotted lanternfly is special, and it goes to Ag and Markets for verification and follow-up, which is then incorporated into their internal agency database.
Thank you, Jen. And so we have organized this volunteer effort that uses iMapInvasives, and I'm just going to talk a little bit where that came from. So the motivation was that New York State needs to monitor spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven, and to do that, we need more eyes on the ground. So New York State is a huge area. We need a lot of help to cover all that ground. And we recognize that you know your area best, your local parks, your favorite trails, your backyard. So we really need to enlist your help, and we need the distribution data in a centralized database. And to sort of get at all of those goals, the resulting volunteer initiative is a group of trained IMAP users across the state who survey for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven in their local areas and report findings to iMapInvasives. And so I think some of the people on the call are already participating. That's great, and we hope some more people on the call are also interested in participating. So anyone can participate. And what we're asking participants to do is to claim a location to survey, and I'll show you the grid map that we use for that later. To check for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven at multiple times throughout the year, and then to report whether or not they found spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven as presence and not detected records in iMapInvasives. And so that boils down to four main steps. So creating an iMapInvasives account, picking a place to survey, prepping to do that survey, and then actually conducting those surveys. And you can see detailed steps at our website. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the online application. So you can access the database online at our website, and I'll show you how to get there in a second. And that's where you can see the data. You can also enter data into the database. But the more popular tool for entering data is the mobile app, which is made for entering data really quickly and easily when you're out in the field. I'm going to show the online website. So we're going to log into iMap, navigate the online interface, and create a record online. To get to iMapInvasives, you go to our website at iMapInvasives.org. There's a lot of resources you can look through, including self-guided training documents in the training tab. And you can also click on the Spotted Lanternfly button to view information about our project. But to get to the database, you go to that login at the top right. And so if you already have an account, you can enter that in at the top. If you forgot your password, you can click the Forgot Password button. And if you don't have an account, you use the sign up box below. So you enter your information, your name, make a password, and then you'll see a box for jurisdiction. And that's simply the state or province where you'll be using iMapInvasives. So for most people on the call today, that will be New York State. So you can select New York there. And when you hit join, you'll get a pop-up that tells you to check your inbox for an activation link. And so make sure you go over into your emails inbox and look for an email from iMap. And there will be a link to go accept the user agreement, which will then activate your account. And then you'll be all ready to sign up. So it's really important to go find that email and activate your account. Make sure to check your junk or spam folders. Sometimes it lands there. And then once you log in, you will first see a notification about any updates. Once you're clear on that, you can X that out. And then you'll see the map of where invasive species data is in North America submitted to iMapInvasives. And so you'll notice hexagons with orange circles. Those are areas where invasive species have been reported, with the larger orange circles indicating more records. And just to give you a brief orientation of where everything is, so on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see some navigation tools. So zooming in and out, there's a little search button where you can enter in an address. There's also the main menu on the top left, and you'll see your account there. That's where you will find your person ID, which you'll need to sign up for Grid Square, but there's instructions on that as well. And then at the top, there are the action tools, so where you create records, you filter on species, and then there's the geographic layers on the right-hand side. So first, I'm zooming into New York State, and this is showing you all of the data for all species that we have in iMapInvasives, except for the hidden ones, which there are just a couple, like spotted lanternfly. So I'm going to show you how you view just the distribution for tree of heaven. So you can filter on a lot of things, date, habitat type, but what's most often used is the species name. And I encourage you to use the state species list by using that toggle. And then you can type in the species you're interested in into the search box. So I typed in tree of heaven, and then you click apply filter. And then while that loads, I switched the base map. So if you go into geographic layers, you can change base maps. I sometimes think it's useful to just go to light gray. And light gray just makes it a lot easier to see what's going on sometimes if you're just looking at like a basic distribution. And so you can see Tree of Heaven. Michael actually showed this map earlier, but you can see that it's common in some parts of the state, not reported as often in other parts of the state. And like what Michael was starting to get at, those blank areas, so are those places we haven't surveyed, or are those places where we know it's not there? One way to check is the not detected records. So if you go to layers on off, you can pick which data you're looking at. So if you toggle on not detected, you'll also see those records, because by default, you're just seeing the confirmed presence records. So if you toggle that on, it will pop up the not detected points. So you can see there are some places where we've checked for Tree of Heaven, but also a lot of places where we haven't checked yet. So that's why we need your help to check if this species is anywhere across the state and could potentially aid the spread of spotted lanternfly. And so the next thing that I'll show here is, if you wanted to create a record in the online interface, that is an option. So there's the Create Record tool at the top. So you might want to zoom in first. So I typed in Albany and then zoomed in to Albany. And then you can use the Create Record tool. And you may want to zoom in even more if you're creating a record. I'll also show in a second that, okay, so you see that the orange hexagons, they broke up into points. So once you zoom in close enough, you don't have to look at the hexagons, you can see the individual records. And so that's what those green points were. And so once you're zoomed in to the location where you found whatever species you happen to find, you can then use the Create Record tool at the top. And then it's also sometimes useful to switch the base map again. For instance, you might want the satellite base map to really pick the location. And so if you click Presence, then you can indicate on the screen, or indicate on the map where you found the point. And then if you hit Next, once you have the point correct, you could even do a polygon if it was a clump of Tree of Heaven, for example. And since this is a text record, just for demonstration purposes, I selected a fake species for testing. And this is a species that I encourage everyone to use. So we created this species just so that you can enter as many records as you want without having to worry about messing with the database, so you can get used to the data reporting process. And so you'll notice that the observer and date are automatically captured, especially if you're logged in. And if you scroll down, there are some more things you can fill out. The most important one being to add a photo. So like Meg mentioned before, it's super important to get really nice, clear photos so that our network of confirmers can verify the species identity. And so if you click Add Photo, you'll be able to access the files on your device, whatever device you're on. Most times people use the online website on the computer, but I will mention that it is mobile responsive, so you could do this on your phone, and then your phone's photo library would be accessible here. And then below that, there are some more detailed fields as well. They sometimes change depending on whether you picked a plant species or an insect. And these are all optional. For instance, the distribution. So for a plant, you can you can select how densely or sparsely it was distributed. And then some advanced fields as well. But those are all optional. So the key things are that you've picked the right point on the map, you've selected the species that you found. You shouldn't have to change observer and date unless you're reporting something you found in the past, and then the photo. And then everything else is just extra if you happen to have that information. So then you can complete the record, and it will save it. And so if you reported spotted lanternfly this way, the point will actually not be visible to you since it's a hidden species. But if you reported Tree of Heaven, you will be able to see that record. So you'll actually have to go into the layers on off and go into the unconfirmed layer for those to show up. So if you have the unconfirmed on, eventually pink points will pop up and you'll be able to see your record. And once it's confirmed, once someone goes in and confirms a species identity, it'll turn to a green point. And that's all I wanted to show for that, so I'll go back to my PowerPoint. And feel free to enter any questions about iMapInvasives. I'll talk about it again for a much shorter period, in a couple minutes. But the next step I'll talk about is selecting a place to survey. So we have a grid square sign-up map on our website at nyimapinvasives.org/SLF. And this has a map of the state with some areas that have been selected where we need help from volunteers. So we took a national grid for New York State of 1 kilometer grid squares, and Department of Ag and Markets, parks, New York Natural Heritage Program, we all selected 1 kilometer grid squares across the state where we need help from volunteers to complement the survey efforts that are already underway by Ag and Markets and other organizations. So for instance, there's the focus grid squares, which are orange with a red boundary. So those are the most important places where we're looking for help. So those are places where maybe they're near a known infestation, maybe they're a park with a disturbed area, so like a really high risk area, for example. And then in addition to those high priority focus grid squares, we also have 2 other types of grid squares that we've opened. So blue means that there's some sort of public access land, which makes it a good place for volunteers to survey. Not necessarily the whole square, but somewhere in the square there's a public access area. And then also in purple, we've opened grid squares where there are known records of Tree of Heaven, and so that's from the iMapInvasives data set. And one question we've got quite often is people who are interested in participating, but they have some sort of park near them that they're interested in, or they want to participate on their own property, and we don't have that grid square opened. And so really that's fine. Like, you can definitely still participate without your survey site being in one of the grid squares. So these grid squares were just selected to sort of direct most of the volunteer efforts into some key areas, but we really need spotted lanternfly and Tree of Heaven survey efforts pretty much anywhere. So your efforts would still be extremely useful. We would still love you to participate and submit records to iMapInvasives, even if you're outside of a grid square. So that's an alternative option for participating here. And so I'll show how the grid square process works in just a second. So again, you go to our website, and on the SLF page, so you can get that either by going to our website and clicking on the SLF button, or going into, or typing SLF into the browser. And there's a number of resources for you. There's links to the Ag and Markets resources. They have some really great help docs on identifying species. You can connect with your prisms. There's steps on how to participate in the project. And there's some important information for any of our volunteers that you should be aware of if you want to go out and survey. But all the way at the bottom is where the grid square map is. And there will be some instructions listed around it. And so I encourage you to look through those helpful tips. But for now, I'll just go to the launch sign-up map. And so there's that big green button in the middle of the map, and that will bring you into another tab which actually has the map. And so you'll notice 2 things probably the first time you open up this map. There's a panel to find unclaimed grid square, and there's of course a big map of New York State. And you may notice that there aren't any grid squares, and that's because they're not displayed at the zoomed out level, so you would have to zoom in using the plus button there. And just to give you an idea of some of the basic tools, so there's a legend where you can figure out what everything on the map is. That's one of the more basic standard tools. And then there's zooming in and out. And that home button brings you back to the zoomed out view. And one thing you may find most useful is the Find Unclaimed Grid Square panel on the left. So that's how you can find grid squares near you. So if you type in your town, it will zoom to that area, and you can drag around the map if you want to move around. You can zoom out or in if you want to see more or less grid squares. But then once you see grid squares in your area, I encourage you to first look for any orange grid squares, because those are the high priority ones. But there may be other areas you're interested in. So if you click on one of those grid squares, then you'll see the next step. So if you're interested, you can claim that grid square using the Claim This Grid Square button, which brings you to a form. So your IMAP person ID, which you can find on your account page in iMapInvasives, and there's instructions there as well. You type that in, it's usually a 5-digit number, and then just your name and your email. And then once you claim that grid square, it'll say you've claimed it successfully, and then you can go back to the map. And your grid square might stay whatever color it was for a couple minutes, but it'll eventually refresh, and it will turn into a gray grid square, and you can click on it, and it'll actually say that it's claimed by your person ID. And now to show you some more useful things on the map, say you want to go out to survey, so you want a really good idea of what is around your grid square. So if you change the base map, like I just did on the screen, you can switch to a satellite map, and then zoom in on your grid square. And once you get a good view of it, you could also print it so that you can have it for later. And so there's that print icon, and you can either print to PDF, or if you are connected to a printer, you could print it out on paper. And if you want to change how it looks, you can turn layers off and on. For instance, you could get rid of a layer that's in your way of viewing or something like that. And then another way to find your old grid squares, if you didn't print out an image, is to go back to the map and click on the Find My Claimed Grid Squares tab. And you saw that I typed in my person ID and then hit the Apply button at the bottom green section. And so it highlights any grid squares on your map. And if you just selected them in one zoomed in area, it would zoom in more on that. And so that's the grid squares. So I'm almost done here. And so step 3 is prepping for surveying in your grid squares. So you pick the grid square, but now you have to actually go out and do that survey. And so we encourage you to plan out where you want to survey, or how you want to be reporting those records first before you go out in the field. So you can use the online version that I showed earlier, but you would have to be connected to the internet usually. So you would either have to do that when you get home after a survey, or you would have to survey and then go home. Oh, that's the first option I just said. The other option is if you're in somewhere that happens to have connectivity, then you might be able to use the iMap Online out in the field. But for most people, we have found that the iMap mobile app is really useful. This allows you to very quickly and easily record data when you're out in the field and have no connectivity, and then quickly upload them when you get home. And so I'm not going to do a full demo on the app, but I encourage anyone out there who's interested to download it onto your phone. Just search for iMapInvasives in the App Store. And it's got kind of this three-step workflow. So setting up your account is the first thing you'll have to do. Pretty much just put in your information and retrieve IMAP lists. And once you've done that step, you're really good to go. So the rest of it's pretty easy, pretty fast. So whenever you want to record an invasive species, you just go into the app, click Add Observation, and then you're brought to this screen, and you can take a photo. We highly encourage you to take a photo and just fill out the information. And you can do that even if you're way out in the wilderness and have no connectivity. Just the final step is once you get back home, you simply upload your records, and then they're in the online database. And since I just kind of gave you an overview of what the mobile app is, I'll show you where you can find more information. So if you need more guidance than that quick overview, we've got a lot of resources on our website. So we've got nymfinvasives.org/training, or just click the training tab on our website. And we have a lot of help talks, but we also have our recorded webinars. And so on our YouTube channel, we actually have a very quick, it's less than 10 minutes. It's a full tutorial on getting set up with IMAP and submitting a fake species record. So I highly encourage people to use that quick playlist to submit a fake species record before they go out into the field so that they have a plan for submitting records. And it's also linked very prominently on the SLF page. And so step 4 is surveying, is actually going out and doing your survey. And so Jen will cover this piece.
Great, thanks, Mitch. All right, so now you're all set up with the technical components of signing up for a grid and reporting your search efforts to IMAP. So let's talk a little bit about the actual field work. First and foremost, we want you to be safe. So always be mindful of traffic conditions and the weather. You know, it's always changing in New York. So check it before you go out and probably once you get into the field. And make sure that your target spots within your grid allow for public access. So you can start by selecting a grid in an area that's familiar to you. And, you know, study the map before you head out. And then within that grid, try to identify 1 to 3 spots that you can access. So, you know, something that is within your comfort level and, of course, safely and publicly accessible. And then once you get out there, survey a variety of surfaces. So these can be natural surfaces, tree trunks, and so forth, man-made surfaces as well. As we saw, spotted lanternfly can, you know, be just about anywhere in disturbed areas and natural areas. And then use your IMAP mobile app on your phone to report your search efforts. So if you think you found tree of heaven or spotted lanternfly, you're going to enter these as presence records with the mobile app. If you searched and you did not find anything, then that's great. Valuable information, enter those as not detected records. And please also enter the number of minutes that you spent searching at each of those locations. So we recommend about 3 to 10 minutes of searching for each spot. And we hope that you'll be able to, you know, revisit your grid square every 2 to 6 months to look for these different life stages of spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. And if possible, try to collect 20 not detected or presence records this year at your grid square. And so for an example, in this map on the right, you can see the red shading, or the red box is where the grid square is that I signed up for. And this is along the Mohawk River. And I know this site, and I know that the parking is actually outside of the grid square, so that yellow star is where you would park. But that's okay because I'm familiar with the site, and I know I can safely walk into that grid square. And I also know there's a lot of different areas to cover. So there's a swimming pool and, you know, man-made surfaces that I can start out with. And there's also trails throughout the woods that are within my comfort level. So let's say I start at those park buildings near the pool. And at one point I find, say, a small clump of tree of heaven trees. So I'm going to stop, take out my mobile app, and enter a presence point for tree of heaven. And then I spend the next 5 minutes searching those tree trunks for spotted lanternfly. Luckily, nothing's found. So once again, my mobile app, I entered a not detected record for spotted lanternfly and the time that I spent searching. So these are all just general guidance. Do what you can. Any search efforts that you're able to report is extremely valuable. And so we just encourage you to get out there and look for things and report your information.
Thanks so much, Jen. So that actually brings us to the wrap-up. So I'll hand it back over to Meg, and people can keep entering questions into the chat as they come up, and we've got a couple great ones lined up, and we'll get to those soon.
Anyone who is not yet connected with their local PRISM, so that's PRISM as in Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, I highly encourage you to sign up for the listserv for the PRISM in your region. They have wonderful information about invasive species and invasive species events within your region of the state. I'll leave you with some take-home messages. Tom mentioned a negative survey or a not detective survey is good. Michael mentioned check your trees. Jen reminded everybody to know exactly where you're going before you head out and where you can safely and publicly access your grid square. And Mitch reminded everyone to submit a fake species record and check it online before you go out in the field to make sure your iMap mobile app is set up correctly.
Great, yeah, so I have a couple questions lined up as I'm pulling those up. Thank you so much for everyone who attended and who has participated in this event with us. We encourage you to survey, report to iMap, and enjoy the great outdoors. And there are lots of events going on this week for New York Invasive Species Awareness Week, including tonight. Many of us here will also be on another event. So at 7 p.m. there will be a live Q&A panel. So any questions you feel like come up after our Q&A session right now, I encourage you to attend our evening webinar where you'll hear from Tom and Michael and some other people from Ag and Markets and New York State IPM. And so the first question that I'll read out loud is from James. So he said, I've seen some egg masses on the side of my stone house and in the creases of my front door. Some seem hatched and have 4 to 8 small round holes coming out of them. Wondering if other insects use these kinds of masses and how to tell the difference. And I think maybe Tom could take this one, or Jen?
Sure. Thanks for the question. The egg masses are similar to other insects. The one that's most commonly confused is gypsy moth, which would have more a round egg versus a linear shaped, almost grain of rice shaped egg. The best thing to do, I would say, is to take some photos of those egg masses and submit them either through iMapInvasives or directly to New York State Department of Agriculture through our reporting site. So if you could submit those photos, we could do our best to ID what the egg mass is. We would definitely be able to ID it if it's spotted lanternfly egg mass. But certainly go ahead and submit photos of those.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. We've gotten some reports to iMap recently of gypsy moth egg masses, for example. So that's another type of egg mass that you might encounter this time of year. So our next question, probably another one for Tom. How do you deal with the SLF and the TOH to get rid of them or control them?
Well, there's several methods. So I'll use Ithaca as an example. So the infested trees we found in Ithaca, we surveyed extensively. The infested trees were removed. Now this is a very limited site. There were very limited numbers. So the infested trees were removed and chipped, and the chips were disposed of in a nearby site. What will continue to happen is we will continue to survey those locations for additional egg masses and additional any life stage really. We will set up traps in the area. Excuse me. We'll set up traps in the area and also monitor that way. So we'll be surveying visually and by trap. And then the third thing that we'll do is, I already mentioned, we'll continue to monitor those chips that were removed from those sites. There are chemical treatments that are approved depending on the situation. That's more costly, and with budgets, governmental budgets the way they are at this time, we can only use that, if at all, on a very limited basis, because of available resources. So spraying is an option. Trapping and survey are also options. Removing all the ailanthus trees really doesn't help. A lot of times what happens is, if you cut down the ailanthus tree, as Michael mentioned, you'll get fresh new growth. They'll sucker up from their roots, they'll sucker up from a stump, and then all you're basically doing is giving them their preferred food in abundance. Rather than having one, if you cut down an ailanthus tree, you cut it down and don't treat the stump, basically what you have is 15 new ailanthus trees. With tender new growth, which is what spotted lanternfly really loves. So cutting down all the ailanthus trees is problematic. So, and then they're also widespread. So, but there are treatment methods that can be used. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So the next question, I would say maybe this one will be for Michael, but other presenters might also have thoughts. So the question is, will apps like LeafSnap dependably identify Tree of Heaven leaves? This question's from John.
I'm not familiar with LeafSnap as an app, and I haven't used a lot of plant identification applications. But
Okay.
So I can't say whether or not it will, but it seems like a common species, like a lot of common species, like Tree of Heaven, it would be hard for those algorithms to decipher it compared to other trees. It's worth a try.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Jen?
Yeah, I can jump in too, because I have used LeafSnap a little bit, and iNaturalist or Seek a little bit as well, and both of them use machine learning or artificial intelligence essentially to do pattern recognition and try to recognize whether or not it's a particular species. And like Michael said, since there are so many lookalikes to Tree of Heaven, that can be a little problematic. I would recommend that if you're using one of those, to get a very clear shot of the leaves all spread out. Kind of like with Michael's slideshow, he had some nice photos of the leaves, all sitting out flat and detached from the tree, and so you could see each of the individual leaflets and whether it's toothed or not. So it will depend, whether or not you get a good hit, I guess, with that machine learning algorithm will depend on how clear your photo is and whether or not you're picking up on those distinctive characteristics. So, it's something worth trying, but, I still think, of course I'm biased, the human eye, certainly has a lot to win over on or has, a heads up on some of those really distinctive characteristics that you can hone in on. So, it's something to try out, but also, look up those characteristics that were pointed out in the presentation.
Thank you, Jen. And I'm not sure if IMAP people or Ag and Markets people will take this one, but I'll leave that up to you. So the question is, could you talk about why spotted lanternfly observations are not publicly viewable?
Tom, do you want to take that one from the Ag and Markets perspective on the data, permissions?
Yeah. Yep, I was trying to get to my mute button, but I wasn't moving quick enough. So New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets is a regulatory agency. We regulate nurseries, greenhouses, growers, things like that. Things are marked as confidential because if we detect spotted lanternfly at an establishment, it may negatively impact that establishment by no fault of their own. And also the other concern is that, and this has actually occurred in the past with other pests, which is why we're kind of keen to it, that false reports can also have a tremendously negative impact on a business. So a rival business can report that they have XYZ pest when they really don't, and that would drive, customers away from that establishment based on false information. So unless it's confirmed, and also as as a regulatory body, we have a regulate. We're by law, we're not allowed to disclose certain information, certain personally identifiable information. It's within the public trust. So we kind of balance that with these, with the reporting of spotted lanternfly and even Asian longhorn beetle, and there's a few others as restricted because, we want to confirm that yes, it is that insect, and also we don't want to have any greater negative impact, to New York's economy or to businesses than it actually has to be. As far as quarantine information or any treatments and like that, there's some, as I said, confidential business information or personally identifiable information that we, by law, have to safeguard. So we're kind of balancing those two while still working with the public to report these species.
Thank you, Tom. So I see two more questions. I'm going to take one of them because it's a fast question, and then I'll go to the other more large question. So this question is from one of our attendees named John, and he asks, do you want volunteers to stick with one grid square per person? And so participants can take more than one grid square. We would definitely, if you're interested in doing more, by all means, do more surveying. But to start out, we would suggest sticking with maybe 1 to 2, possibly even 3, but try to keep it small first. Start with a couple and see how the surveying goes. If you are able to conduct surveys in all of those places and it's going well, then you could answer some more. Then you could do some more grid squares. But we really want to, when you sign up for a grid square, you're kind of making a commitment that you're going to do a couple surveys and check for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven at multiple times. So I'd say don't sign up for more than you could handle when you're just starting. And so I have one more big question, and then I'm going to check to see if there are any more after that.
Mitch,
yep.
Can I jump in there just for a second?
Yep.
One other thing I want to caution with, right in line with what Mitch was just saying, kind of start off slow. One of the concerns is that once a grid square is claimed, it's not claimable by someone else. So if somebody well-intentioned goes in and claims 15 grid squares, but they're in reality only able to do 10, that leaves 5 grid squares that could be claimed by someone else that are not being surveyed. So, only claiming the grid squares that you can actually commit to it's very important.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And this next question is probably also for you, Tom. It's a big one. It's, does the spotted lanternfly need the tree of heaven as part of its life cycle? Can we eradicate the tree of heaven? Will that get rid of spotted lanternfly? And you've answered part of that before, but I wonder if you have any more thoughts on that.
The answer is, the short answer is no, for both. Tree of heaven is so widespread. There's really no feasible way of eradicating it within New York State or pretty much anywhere in the United States at this point. There's not enough resources there to do that. And also it might actually spread spotted lanternfly because although tree of heaven is its preferred host, there is some research from the University of Pennsylvania and Department of Agriculture in Pennsylvania that there are other host trees that it can complete its life cycle on. So it's not an obligate species. It doesn't have to have tree of heaven to complete its life cycle. It can use other plants. Its preferred host is tree of heaven. My preferred meal is steak, but if there's spam, I'll eat spam. If there's no steak, it's kind of the same thing with spotted lanternfly. If its preferred host, tree of heaven, is not available, it'll seek others that it can complete its life cycle on. So So eliminating tree of heaven would not eliminate spotted lanternfly. It would actually probably spread it to other trees and spread faster than it is now. Because at least now we can concentrate on tree of heaven. It's pretty readily and easily identifiable. So it's an easy survey tool to target those trees versus a list of trees.
Thank you so much, Tom. And I think we'll leave that as the last question since we've gone over a little bit. I do see that there are a couple more in the Q&A. A lot of them have to do with treating tree of heaven. And to answer questions on how to manage invasive species like tree of heaven, one very great resource for anyone in New York State is their PRISM. So I encourage you to look into which PRISM your location falls into, and they often have a lot of information on their website on the particulars of treating certain species. So I encourage you to connect with your PRISM to get those sorts of details. And also tonight at 7, we're having a live panel where you can ask more questions about Tree of Heaven and IMAP, and there will be opportunities to ask your questions there as well. So I encourage anyone interested to register at nyimappinvasives.org/training. And with that, we thank everyone so much for coming. I hope you learned a lot. This was very great for us to get more people involved with this project. So have a great day, everyone, and have a great New York Invasive Species Awareness Week. And thank you to all of our presenters.